Last night I was speaking about a different gear that we can function in when living life. A gear that for a lot of people is unknown to exist. And that gear is a place where we still function in life, participating. However, we find ourselves uninvolved psychologically in what's happening. So fully involved biologically, and yet the thinking mind that was previously always judging and wanting life to be a particular way has quietened down. And in order for this to become a way of being in life, it needs to be practiced. It's not something that just happens instantaneously and that's it. It's actually a movement away from a heavily ingrained, habitual way of living. And so breaking a habit tends to be gradual, and what happens is we tend to get pulled back into the habit. And so we need to pull out of it. So meditation is a valid part of the process. So we often hear that there's no effort to be made, that everything can change instantaneously. And that too is accurate. And here I am saying that there is a gradual change, and that practice is part of that gradual change. And that too is accurate. Seems like they're contradictory. But when seen from different perspectives, when different movements in the process are seen, we do see that there is the potential for shifts to happen instantaneously. So if we find ourselves thinking, the dropping into being is something that can happen instantaneously. That movement from thinking into being is not something that happens gradually. It's not about us using the mind to slow down the mind, and we saying, "Oh, please, mind, will you stop?" Please, it's not a gradual movement in that sense. It's the thinking mind functioning, and then an awareness or a thought arising that says stop. And the stop is not so much an instruction, but a realization. Stop is a realization that all this thinking that's going on, which is deeply believed to be valuable, to be useful, is actually the problem. It's the uncomfortableness. The ongoing commentary about how life should be. The commentary about how the other should have acted, or how I should have acted, or the commentary about what life needs to look like in the future for me to be happy or complete. All of that commentary is what is keeping us out of our completeness. And once this is realized, once we start tasting the essence of the human being, when we start resting in our own being, we start to have an experience, an experiential contrast between the two different gears, the two ways in which life can be lived. And so each time there is a dropping into being, which is the instantaneous cutting off of thinking. And we find, even without the commentary, life still is. It's still here. And what we might come to appreciate is, and I am here, I am intrinsically required in order for the experience from this perspective to be here. And if we touch into that part of ourself, we realize that the thinking mind is essentially an uncomfortableness with ourself. And this other gear is already comfortable with what is. So that shift starts to have more and more weight once this is realized. The more this is realized that there are two different places to live life from, the more easily the stop will arise. Stop is just the reminder, the realization that that thinking is not optimal. And so the stop is a reminder to come back into being. Because the thinking is based on deeply ingrained beliefs that are assumed to be true. For example, the belief that in order for everything to be okay, life needs to look a certain way. Deeply ingrained and believed to be truth. Then it makes sense that the thinking mind is going to function in such a way that it's strategizing in order to achieve a particular outcome that is believed to be what will bring about happiness. So once that is in place, it makes sense that the thinking is going to keep happening. So the remembering that that thinking is actually not at all as valuable, not at all based in truth as it is believed to be, cuts it off and we drop into being. It means that even mid-sentence, when the thought is halfway through completion, the thought that says stop means that it becomes valid to not even need to complete the strategy, complete the thought. It means the thought coming up that says stop this thinking that's not valuable can bring us back into being instantaneously. But because the deeply ingrained belief is exactly that, it's deeply ingrained and believed to be true, we can drop into being and realize that even without things being the way I imagine they should be, I am, that I exist. And there's something very unique and special about the core of the human existence, primarily that is complete and self-fulfilling, self-contenting. So we drop into being and everything is seen to be complete. However, the deeply ingrained beliefs haven't been completely uprooted just because they've been cut off in that moment. So they have a power to essentially make us forget our being, pull us back onto this other highway. And each time we get pulled onto the other highway, thinking that what we're doing is useful for our happiness, after a while we might realize, oh no, this is the uncomfortableness, this movement of mind that is telling me that I need life to look a certain way in order for me to be complete. That is the opposite of what I'm really looking for, the opposite of peace of mind, the opposite of happiness for the human being. So then the thought might come up, stop. We drop into being again. So this dropping in is instant. Yet we find ourselves in a process of being dragged back. But each time we come back, remember, that's another reinforcement that what I really am is here right now and complete. And each time we remember that and get experiential feedback of that, then the process is a process of finding ourselves able to rest in being for longer, finding ourselves remembering more frequently that there is this other place to live life from. until one day the being dragged back into suffering becomes so short-lived, so irregular, that we realize that this is my home, that other highway we were on was us being lost, thinking that we were actually heading in the right direction. And it also makes sense that at some point, not only does it become very infrequent, but it makes sense at some point it can become completely absent. That we don't get dragged out into the thinking mind again. Because the root of the thinking mind has been completely uprooted. And so part of this practicing is about believing that, and not only believing, but from our own experience, that the noise in the head does have the potential to quieten down. Not necessarily through us controlling it, because the controlling the noise, insisting that the noise quietens down, is very likely to be more noise. So the idea that I have to stop thinking usually becomes a project of the very thinking mind that is hopefully going to quieten down. So if the thinking mind, which is meant to quieten down in order for there to be peace of mind, takes on a project of quietening itself down, it really is like the dog chasing its tail. And so there needs to be a realization of this at some point, a recognition. The working mind, which is very different from the thinking mind, needs to be equipped with the understanding that this is what tends to happen as the thinking mind tries to control, tries to gain outcomes that it hears are going to be good for it. And so if the working mind becomes equipped with an understanding of how the thinking mind works, then at some point the working mind starts seeing if the thinking mind is taking on this dropping into being or this ending of thinking as a project, which is actually just perpetuating thinking. If that's what's happening, then the working mind can recognize it. And as soon as the working mind recognizes it, then the game is up. The game carries on when the form of suffering, the form of the thinking mind, isn't seen to be happening. So having expectation about the future, expectation about how the past should have turned out, is part of the thinking mind. That's a form of suffering. And when the thinking mind has an expectation of how our experience needs to be, then that's an expectation that is inevitably going to create more noise. So how can we live without an expectation that suffering comes to an end, but with the understanding that suffering can come to an end? And furthermore, hearing that the end of suffering is what we're really seeking, what will really satisfy. So it's a fine line when we need to start observing this movement. As soon as the thinking mind hears that the end of suffering or peace of mind is what we're really seeking, it gets very excited and turns it into an expectation. Now, if we have expectations, then that means we won't accept anything different. So if we have an expectation that our suffering ends, we're not going to accept suffering when it arises. And the non-acceptance of suffering when it arises is more suffering. So it's a catch-22. Or it looks like it. How can I hear that the end of suffering is what I'm really looking for, and then be told that if I turn that into an expectation, it's going to create more suffering. It's a bit like telling someone to not think about the monkey. However, there is a way in life where this can happen, this movement can happen in a different way. And that is where life delivers new conditioning. The new conditioning becomes part of our makeup. And that makeup functions automatically. It's not something that we need to do. It's something that happens. So if I were to suggest that there is a practice that we can take on, I'm not suggesting it to be a practice in the sense that we would normally, or not to relate to it in the way we normally would, where, okay, there's a practice and I have to work hard on this and I have to make this work. This is a much more natural practice. It's a practice that may start to happen automatically without you needing to set a regime, simply because you become designed by new conditioning to function that way. And that's what the teaching is always doing. It's delivering new conditioning that hopefully changes our up-to-date conditioning. And then we find ourselves moving through life, and the up-to-date conditioning automatically functions. Not your doing, not the movement of a doer that says, I need to make this happen, but rather a biological functioning. So that means that if we become equipped with the understanding of the different forms of suffering. So let's take blame, for example. Blame being a form of suffering, which is an attitude towards actions that happen through the other person that deliver pain to us or pain to someone that we love. And the attitude is an attitude of seeing the other as a separate individual entity that has done something that has attacked my completeness, delivered pain to me. And therefore, I blame them as if they are the doer who has attacked me at the core of my being. So once the working mind has become equipped to understand that blame is a form of suffering and understands what blame is, when blame arises, then that blame is just an input arising in the present moment. It's recognized, just like if a bird flew past. If a bird flies past, you don't have to do the seeing of it. The seeing just happens. And in that moment, when the seeing happens without you having to actively do seeing, another movement is likely to happen. The input of the seeing is there, and then a thought might arise about the bird being an unusual bird, or a pretty bird, or an unattractive bird, or a dangerous looking bird. And that thought is not something that you've set out to achieve. It's not something you've set out to do, to have that thought. It just arises naturally based on the input, the circumstance, and your programming, your design. Your design knows that there are birds in the world, and it knows the birds that it's seen in your lifetime, let's say. And if this bird is unusual, then the input, as it mixes with your makeup, creates a thought, oh, that's an unusual bird. Not something you've done, but something that happens naturally. And so in the spiritual seeking process, the seeking can become something that's effortless. And if the attitude is, the process will happen as it's destined to happen. The process will happen as I am designed for the process to happen. knowing that the outcome is not in my control. The outcome will happen when it's going to happen, as it's going to happen. So attitudinally, we can find seeking happening automatically based on our up-to-date conditioning. And yet the attitude is one of allowing it to happen without having an expectation of what the outcome is going to be. So I'd like to put forward a little analogy that can be useful in allowing us to sit in such a way that the mind may well quieten down, remembering not to turn it into an objective. And it may quieten down because when energy isn't reinvested into a certain movement, eventually the movement runs out of momentum. And sometimes we're so unfamiliar with the fact that the thinking mind can actually quieten down that we don't persist or allow for that to happen for long enough. And so if we don't allow for something to happen for long enough, if it needs time, then what will happen is it won't happen in the little time that we give it, and then we'll keep assuming, well, it's not something that can happen. So a bit like training a dog. If you want a dog to sit, and it's never sat before in relation to a command of sitting, you can't tell the dog sit and expect it to sit. And so a training method exists because it works. And so the training method will tell you need to tell the dog to sit many times. And each time the dog does what you'd like it to do, then give it a reward. And that training method tends to work. If we forget the training method, if we don't really understand the training method, so we ask the dog to sit 5 times and the dog doesn't sit, or it sits 5 times, it sits one of the times we ask it, we give it a reward, and then we need to repeat this. And we repeat it again, and this time we ask it to sit 5 times and it doesn't. If we don't really understand the methodology, we might say, oh, this isn't working, this is really bad, and stop. But if that process was carried on with an understanding, then at a certain point, the dog gets the message, the dog understands, it learns, and then we say sit and the dog sits. But if we stop prematurely, thinking it's not working, then the process doesn't complete. But it was working. We just didn't understand it was. And so allowing the thinking mind to be there and just being there with it for long enough, which is sometimes very uncomfortable, can be one of the ways in which we start to see that the thinking mind is not something that has to be there all the time. It does subside. So the analogy I'd like to introduce is, imagine an auditorium filled with 2,000 people ready to listen to a pianist, let's say, or a speaker. And they're waiting for the act to start. And so everyone's talking amongst themselves, and there's a big din in the auditorium. All of the whispering, and then people are talking louder and louder to get over the noise so that they can be heard. So, you know, the sort of chatter that I'm talking about in an auditorium. And the performer comes out on stage quietly and sits down at the piano and doesn't do anything. And he's not in any great rush. He doesn't feel like he has to start at exactly 10:30. So he sits at his piano quietly, and the talking just carries on. And he's actually really at ease with the talking. He's not in resistance with the talking. It doesn't feel, for him, it's not, well, why don't these people stop so I can start playing? It's like, these people are enjoying themselves, they're talking amongst themselves, this is life. So he's very happy to just sit there. And then some people in the audience realize he's there, so they stop talking and they sit quietly. And then some more people realize, and you know how as it suddenly gets quieter, then more and more people realize something's going on, and the noise. But there's like a few patches of people around the place that haven't realized that everyone else has stopped talking, and so they're still chattering. And maybe some of the people in the audience are getting a little frustrated because they have a resistance against the chatter and the event not starting, and yet the performer is just very happy to sit and wait, like really happy. I'm not. He's not pretending. He's got no need for it to turn out a particular way. At some point, he'll do his thing, and if that's 5 minutes shorter than it was going to be, it's okay. And then one group of people, just two people talking really loud, everyone else has stopped. And they have no idea everyone else has stopped. And they just keep talking. And the person on stage is just happy to sit there. And so eventually they realize and they stop. So when we close our eyes, if we assume the position of the performer on stage, if there are noises outside, dogs barking, people building a house next to you, then you're just the performer on stage, perfectly okay with that being the way things are. What we find is that our tendencies to be a performer on stage waiting, but not at all comfortable with all of the noise and people talking. And so there's an involvement in what is happening. And if that happens, then you might find that you can take a position behind that and find yourself dropping in when it's realized that that's happening. Dropping into being the performer on stage that is okay with everything being as it is. So an appreciation of stillness and silence is often not there. Deeply ingrained in us, if we sit still and silent, unless our journey has progressed to a certain point, thought will arise, oh, why am I doing this? I need to get on with achieving things. And there really isn't an appreciation for the fact that this stillness and silence with oneself is actually the real reward in life. And that can be uncomfortable sometimes because there can be a lot of stuff, let's say, in the system. So when we're still and silent, what we often find ourselves confronting is a lot of unresolved energy. And the nature of that unresolved energy is uncomfortableness. And so allowing ourselves to be with that for long enough, just allowing it to be, is important. Because the intuitive thing is to feel uncomfortableness and move away from it. That means movement. That means getting up and doing something to distract us from turning inwards. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is the only positive movement to sit with the uncomfortableness. But from time to time, it's good to find a movement that sits with something that we'd normally move away from. So I'm not suggesting that we turn this into, oh, I should sit with my uncomfortableness all the time. If we do that, what we might find is that the thinking mind is functioning and saying, this is how I should achieve the outcome that I'm looking for. There's a lot of validity in sitting down in meditation, feeling uncomfortable and realizing I don't feel like sitting in meditation. And allowing yourself consciously, because you've actually recognized consciously that there's an uncomfortable feeling, and allowing yourself to get up and do something else. Now that's the complete opposite of what I've said just before this, which is that we don't sit with ourselves long enough for the silence to set in. So hopefully you can see I'm not telling you this is the only way. It's about honoring at other times what you feel like doing, which is, I don't feel comfortable sitting in meditation, so I'm going to get up. And there's a great liberty in understanding I'm free in each moment to get up. Even if I've said I'm going to sit in meditation for 40 minutes, and you sit, and after 2 minutes you realize, I don't want to do this. So you get up and move away. But if you're doing it consciously, you're really aware. You've brought awareness into the body. And the body's saying, no, I don't want to sit in meditation. And so another part of the working mind says, well, in each moment you're free to do whatever you like. Because part of the thinking mind is following a whole list of shoulds and shouldn'ts. Because it believes that these shoulds and shouldn'ts are going to bring about the best outcome. And that's not how the outcome that we're really looking for as humans comes about. It doesn't come about because the thinking mind says, this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do in order to get pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. What we're really looking for is a dropping outside of the thinking mind that says this is what you should and shouldn't do. So it's just a suggestion to sit with the uncomfortableness from time to time when it feels appropriate. Not this is what you have to do. And so that means you wait for a time when you feel like sitting down in meditation, not something you should do, not something I suggest that you set a time every day, same time for an hour, but you wait for an urge to arise that says, oh, I feel like sitting in meditation. So you're doing it because you feel like it. That means you have to wait for yourself to feel like it. And if you sit and then the feeling is, oh, this is too uncomfortable, I've got lots of things to do, then see whether there is the feeling to remain with that uncomfortableness, or, just as valid, the feeling might be, no, I'm going to just follow what my body is telling me. So actually in both instances you'd be following what your body is telling you. In one instance, your body is telling you want to get up, and you also find that there is not a forced desire to sit with it, but a natural desire that says, oh, I'm interested to see what happens if I sit with this longer. And so the overall feeling is a mix of the uncomfortableness plus a curiosity, an interest, not because we should or we shouldn't, but it's like, oh, I wonder what I'll notice if I just sit with this. And so we sit with it because we feel like it. But if the mix inside is different and there is no curiosity to sit with it, then I suggest you stand up and don't remain in meditation. So why would the curiosity be there? It might be there because we've heard that the thinking mind is habitual, based on deeply ingrained beliefs. It creates this uncomfortableness, this movement away from being with oneself. We've heard that it can be useful to sit with this feeling instead of moving away from it. And so at a particular time we might find a natural curiosity, a natural desire that allows us to sit with it in, funnily enough, a comfortable way, to sit comfortably with the uncomfortableness. If we find ourselves sitting uncomfortably with the uncomfortableness, then I'd suggest we shouldn't be sitting with the uncomfortableness in that moment. If we find that it's comfortable to get up and turn on TV, then I would move towards getting up and turning on TV. Because I would be doing what I feel like doing in that moment. Consciously, not habitually. The uncomfortable feeling might be a habitual feeling that's driving me to feel like watching TV, but as long as I have felt that and am moving, allowing the movement to be towards that, because I'm not putting any shoulds or shouldn'ts in place, then that movement towards watching TV, to me, is a very significant development in the process. We're now listening to what the body is telling us to do. It might not be the body functioning from its natural intelligence. The movement might be part of the psychological misunderstanding. But to the extent that there's a part of us that is recognizing that that misunderstanding is driving me, the part that is aware of this and is allowing the body to move by what is driving it, and interested and aware and taking note of the consequences, then that part is the natural biological intelligence of the body that is witnessing the possible misunderstanding that's driving the body. Does that make sense?
So it's like reinstalling the software.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a computer person at all, but I know enough to say that. Just changing the operational system in a way.
Yeah. And
or altering the operational.
yeah. And the part that we're talking about here is what we can call our attitude to what is happening. So the attitude, or the software, if we want to look at it that way, which is very valid to look at it that way, the programming, the up-to-date conditioning often is to not allow anything to happen consciously, but rather to either move habitually or to move with an attitude that says, oh, I shouldn't do this. I'm tired, but I need to work hard. I should work hard in order to get this outcome. And then the tiredness, for example, is not acknowledged, not listened to, because we have a programming that says, this is how I should live life. I should do this, I shouldn't do that, based on our idea of what's going to give us the best outcome. And what is informing us is a misunderstanding of who we are. So what's informing us about what the best outcome is going to be is misinformation. The list of shoulds and shouldn'ts is something that when we stop functioning through that lens, we find there's a great freedom. And at first it might sound like, no, this is not good. This is not going to get me what I'm looking for. But once the movement takes us to a point where we actually trust that this is a good movement, we don't really need to trust too much. We just need to see that that movement, I should stay in this relationship. I should stay in this job. I should perform in life according to the culture and what they've told me is correct, what my parents have told me is correct. We just need to feel and see how functioning from that place disconnects us and creates a cumulative uncomfortableness over time. For us to have a trust to say, no, what do I feel like doing? Not what I should do, what do I feel like doing? And if we start saying no where we used to say yes, and start saying yes where we used to say no, and realize that in each moment I am free to do any number of things. In each moment there's a large list of options. A list of options that our shoulds and shouldn'ts essentially narrows down to something very, one option. So once we start seeing, well, actually, in practice, I can do something different. So to give you an idea of what I'm getting at is if someone walked in the room now with a gun and put the gun to my head and said, stand up, I'm going to take you outside as a hostage. I have the complete freedom to say yes or no in practice. It's an option, yes or no. And often we don't register that we have options. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that when we pick an option, it's going to be the best option. So if I say no, he might shoot me. If I say yes, then we might go outside and then he'll shoot me. If I say no, he might think, well, this isn't the way it's meant to go, and run out of the room. So the outcome of something is unknown. We can start to learn in life what actions or what choices deliver certain outcomes as a tendency, as a pattern, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be like that every time. But what's more important is to realize I am free in each moment to pick a range of options. So if someone asks you to help them and you say yes all the time, at some point you might register that I feel uncomfortable saying yes all the time. I feel obliged. And that's part of our shoulds and shouldn'ts. I should say yes in order to be liked, let's say. If we realize I can say no, and it can be revolutionary to us. Really? No, you can't say. Yes, you can. You can say no. And if a bravery, in a sense, one way of looking at it, you could say a bravery arises to actually try doing something differently. It's not really a bravery, because why this happens, this change, is when the uncomfortableness gets to a point that it makes sense to do something differently. And so we can start with the small things first. Just, for example, realizing that we're not always honest with our answers, and that then causes complications. So you might practice with someone might say, oh, how come you're late? And there was a lot of traffic on the road. Whereas actually you left half an hour later than you should have. You say, I have an option to do this differently. Oh, why are you late? Oh, I got caught watching TV and I left the house half an hour later than I should have. And we might realize, what a relief. I can't do that because that person will hate me for being late. Yes, maybe. But some consequences are worth what they deliver.
How does this dovetail with the determinism we were talking about yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
The loss of personal doership, where everything is predetermined to happen as whatever's creating all this has determined it should be. Why even talk about, or worry about choices?
Mm-hmm. So yesterday we were talking about how everything is unfolding exactly the way it's destined to unfold. And the rationale is that each of us are functioning exactly according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, and we can't function differently. So in a particular moment, we will function based on how we are in that moment. Now, the talks are simply new conditioning as part of life. So they're not actually telling you how you should or shouldn't function. What they're doing is they're putting forward new conditioning, which is, let's say, an explanation of my experience when I found myself functioning differently. Now, why did I find myself functioning differently? Because my life, up to a certain point, delivered new conditioning. For example, the intensifying of an internal discomfort with myself. And a thought arose, what I'm really looking for is the end of this internal discomfort. So that conclusion was a result of the new conditioning, which includes the feeling in a particular moment of internal discomfort. And so, based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, a thought arose that says, actually, all I'm looking for is the end of this internal discomfort. And then after that, I started to observe what the internal discomfort was. So all of that is part of the unfolding of life that couldn't have happened differently for me based on my makeup and how it kept changing. And as I found myself implementing changes that meant I shifted from functioning according to shoulds and shouldn'ts and shifted to a place where I started feeling what I felt like doing. So as I started doing what I felt like doing, there was feedback, experiential feedback that became part of my new conditioning, which then meant I had to move more and more in that direction, because my new conditioning, which was changing my up-to-date conditioning, was making me realize that that is a more optimal way for me to function, a way that releases a load of internal conflict that I was living with. So in this situation, I'm putting forward concepts that may become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And then what will happen is the thought in a particular moment when you say yes to someone. You say yes, and let's say it feels uncomfortable. And then the thought is, well, actually, why don't I try doing what I feel like instead of what I should? And so in that moment, you might say, oh, actually, if I'm really honest, I'd rather not do what you're proposing. And that's a happening. That's the unfolding of life as it's destined to unfold. So if it doesn't happen, if we say yes when we really feel like no, if we understand that life is unfolding exactly as it's destined, even though we might have in our up-to-date conditioning the notion that doing what I feel like may well deliver a better outcome, in the situation when we find we say yes when in fact we feel no, then hopefully this doesn't turn into an opportunity for shame to arise. Shame that says, oh, here I go again, functioning from my deeply ingrained beliefs of attachment to outcome. Why can't I overcome this? I'm not good enough. That's why I can't overcome it. If it's understood that it's always a movement based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, then there's an understanding, yes, in theory it might be more optimal for me to say no instead of yes. However, I can't find it within myself to say no. What I said was yes, and then the attitude can be an attitude of understanding that was what was destined to happen.
So I'm getting, this is kind of a refreshing way to entertain what other teachers say as acting out of presence.
Mm-hmm. Yes. These are, I guess, new suggestions that come in the form of teachings. All teachings are really doing what I'm describing here. They're giving us suggestions. They're describing things. Sometimes some teachings need to present it as a should and a shouldn't, because some teachings are talking to people that are not ready to not follow instruction. And so, that's a valid teaching that says this is what you should and shouldn't do. It's bringing about change that way. And at some point, another teaching, once that person has moved down their process, another teaching will come in and say, hey, drop the shoulds and shouldn'ts, even of the shoulds and shouldn'ts that are telling you to do very good things. Drop beyond that and see what you really feel like. And so a teaching that says liberation isn't to be found in thinking, that you have to stop thinking, you have to stop listening to concepts. That teaching is actually giving you a concept. The notion that concepts are no use to you is a concept. And what it's doing, that concept is entering your system and becoming part of your up-to-date conditioning that says concepts, it itself is a concept, but it's not telling you it's a concept. Right? It says concepts are no good. Don't listen to concepts. Stop thinking. Just be. And what that has the effect of doing, it itself is a concept. It has the effect of cutting off the movement of some other ingrained concepts or beliefs. The ones that are ingrained are concepts. So a concept is the apple is red, for example. That's a concept. Happiness for the human being is not to be found in the flow of life. Concept. The flow of life is pleasure or pain. Concept. So these are all concepts. Once they become ingrained in the system and believed to be truth, they turn into a belief. So what I am requires life to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order for me to be complete. Concept that is locked away deeply and believed to be absolute truth, not seen to be a concept. And then we function automatically based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes that deeply ingrained belief. And so a teaching recognizes that you're functioning based on all of your ideas about yourself. And then a teaching might realize that another teaching has come in and it has presented concepts, but we tend to be very good at turning them into expectations, turning them into something that we have to follow exactly without having any freedom. And it can be seen that, hey, that teaching has been turned into something that the thinking mind is now trying to control and achieve. And so the teaching says, just stop all of that. Don't listen to all of these complex explanations. Just stop. You don't have anywhere to go. You don't have anything to do. You're already complete right now. Stop. But what about karma? Stop. But Roger says that happiness is to be found in the end of stop. So that teaching has delivered a concept that turns into something quite useful. It turns into a natural movement that stops movement of mind that is seen by the mind to be very useful, whereas actually is the problem. So what I'm putting forward is not a teaching that says in totality. It doesn't say in totality just stop. One half of it is pointing to this place inside of us that is. And the other half of it is pointing to how we function in daily life. And so, yes, I would like to think that what it's doing is giving us options. It's describing different ways that functioning can happen. And in doing that, it allows life to continue to unfold exactly as it's going to unfold, without us needing to control what that looks like. And yet, at the same time, it starts to plant seeds that can become part of what's unfolding. So not seeds that say, I have to interfere with what's unfolding, but seeds that say, for example, in each moment, you have the potential to do what you think you should do or you shouldn't do, or there is the potential for you to function according to what you feel like. And which of the two happens is according to destiny. So whichever one happens, you don't need to blame yourself for it. From your own experience, if you find yourself functioning from doing what you feel like doing, you may start to see that that feels much more aligned and creates a sense of flow with life. So it says, at some point, follow your feelings. It's not really a prescription. It sounds like a prescription. It says this is what you should do. But really, when we look at it, it's a description of what might happen at a particular point in time. You're functioning. Someone says, could you help me with this? And you say, actually, I'm really tired at the moment. Could you ask someone else to help you? And you realize, in this moment, I did exactly what I felt like doing, not what I should or shouldn't have done. And we might realize this is still life unfolding as it's destined to unfold. So, yeah, I like your suggestion that it's a different take on living, coming into the present moment, becoming aware that in each moment we're functioning one way or the other. And that functioning in each moment is according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And to the extent that we find ourselves exposed to new conditioning that starts to allow us to see things more clearly, then that seeing becomes part of a subsequent unfolding of life, but not in a way where we're insisting that it's like that. It becomes a much more spontaneous and natural movement. I realized we haven't been using the microphone. There's a green light. That means it's on.
Check.
Yes.
You spoke yesterday about flip-flopping, like flopping being getting caught in the thinking mind, and flip being released from that, and sort of going back and forth. So I've been experiencing a lot of flop in the past months, and just hearing you talk before about options, something clicked, and I realized when I'm in the thinking mind, there are, let's say, 2 options or 3, and it's so clear that there are 2 or 3 options, and that's it. It's like a filter. But when I'm able to somehow remove that, I see that there are 12. Like, it's. What's my point? My point is that thinking mind filter is very seductive. It's very, we're so trained to live in that, and even the things you discover when you step back from it, you just, oh, I have 12 options. This is awesome. I can do this. I can.
Mm-hmm.
But then you go back into the thinking mind, and you start to, yes, I have 12 options. I could do that, and it starts to narrow it again. So it's like this. For me, it's a real it's been a real challenge to get out of flop lately. And if you have any suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing in the wisdom part of ourselves at some point has to recognize that it's destined for flop to be there as part of life from time to time, and that it's not our job to pull ourselves out of it. The flop will turn into flip when it's destined to turn into flip. And what that does, if it's a natural, if it's a real realization, not that something we're just saying, if we really see that life is a flow and the flop is part of life, just like when depression comes in, you bring it on, and when it leaves, it's not you that has got rid of it. And so when it's from a deep understanding of this, there can be a part of us that relaxes and allows the flop to be there. Now, if the flop is too intense, what that intensity means is that there is no space on the outside to allow it to be. But sometimes all it takes is the introduction of the notion that flop is part of life, especially in the seeking process. After understanding, there is this period of the understanding functioning and things feeling fine, and then just in an instant, overnight, everything reverts back, it seems. And then there is flop. And sometimes it just takes a description of it, where the description makes it completely impersonal and points out that the resistance to the flop is just an intensity of the flopping. Now, if we hear this and there's intense flop and we make effort to just be with, allow the flop to be, if it's not a natural witnessing that kicks in, a natural relaxation, if we say, yeah, I have to relax into the flop, then that's more of the thinking mind trying to do the relaxing into the flop. And we also, whether we can realize this at the time, sometimes it's destined for the flop to be a full flop where there's just, sounds like an Olympic event, where there's no space, right? And that means you're not going to experience any space. There's nothing you can do. And in fact, it might be destined for the insistence on there being space in the flop is what's creating it, making it a full flop.
That's my biggest fear. That, because people weave through this process in different ways. Sometimes it's like a little flip, little flop. And sometimes it's flip, flop. And some people really need to flop in order to get into flip. So, yeah, so there's that. And I have had experiences in my past of big flops. I guess it's like this fear of, oh man, how big does this flop have to be to get back to flip in a more consistent way? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Whether we're actively seeing things in the flop or not, the flop phase is really useful. It's not just an unfortunate part of the process. It delivers something in the process. It delivers contrast, and contrast is what allows us to really see things clearly. And one of the biggest benefits, because as I've said many times, we can have an understanding, and until the understanding is based on our own experiential seeing of things, it's not as complete as it can be. So to give you an idea, I haven't used this example for a while, I did some time back, at the deepening of the intellectual understanding into total understanding. So I used the example in the past of being in India and walking up a mountain path that I used to walk up regularly, and coming across a little monkey. There were lots of monkeys, but there was this little monkey, looked like it was only a few weeks old, and it was at the edge of the path reaching out to me. And several years earlier, someone had told me that if you smile at a monkey, they're going to take that as a sign of aggression. And when they first told me, the way the information went into my brain, I went, oh, that's strange. Why? And then I thought about it, I thought deductive reasoning, and I thought, oh, it must be because when you're smiling, you're showing your teeth. And in monkey language, you show your teeth at another monkey when you're really angry at them, when you're going to kill them. And so it clicked intellectually. Someone gave me a concept. When you smile at a monkey, they take it as a sign of aggression. And then I thought about it and it clicked. It made sense intellectually. As opposed to if I didn't realize why that might be the case, then it wouldn't even make sense intellectually. Anyway, so I'm walking up and there's this little monkey, and it was reaching its hand out to me and wanted to play, and had these big brown or black eyes, and all of the features on the monkey. I'm sure you've seen little monkeys from time to time. The creases in the ears and everything, and it looked like a human. Just was amazing. And a big smile came onto my face when I saw this cute little monkey. And as soon as I smiled at it, it shrieked and jumped back about a meter. And its mother came rushing over as though something was very wrong. And in that moment, it clicked. My intellectual understanding went much deeper, based on an observation of the concept for myself in my own daily life experience. So I then played around with this a few in the following week, because you don't want to get something and say this is how it is after one testing of the situation, because it might be an anomaly. So I smiled at some other monkeys. The first one I smiled at was a big monkey, and instead of it jumping away, it ran towards me, aggressive, and I jumped back. And so I put another tick next to the concept. And then the third time, I smiled at a monkey that was out on a bridge wire, quite far away, and it was eating, and it didn't really care less that I was smiling at it, because it was interested in the eating. It was out on a wire suspending a suspension bridge, and it knew that I couldn't get near it. So so in certain situations you can smile at a monkey and they're not going to care. But as you test these things for yourself, the intellectual understanding becomes known. So if you're an expert in a particular field, you've spent every day of the last 3 years observing an earthworm, and then someone comes along and says, oh, earthworms, whatever, live under rocks. And this particular earthworm doesn't live under rocks. Then not as a concept. So when you say, oh no, this earthworm doesn't live under rocks, it's not just a concept. I mean, what you're putting forward is a concept. No, this earthworm doesn't live under rocks. But that from your own observation of time and time again being present with the earthworm and how it functions. And so as we become present with our own functioning and tick off our functioning relative to the framework that's delivered. So the framework says, gives various descriptions, and it suggests they're just pointers for you to investigate for yourself and come to see for yourself time and time again. So the more ticks you put next to the concepts, the more the understanding becomes total. And so one of the most important things for us to understand deeply in the teaching is the notion that what we're really looking for is happiness for the human being, but that happiness is only to be found in the form of peace of mind. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. What that means is peace of mind is the absence of the flop. Peace of mind is the flip. Happiness is the flip. What we're really looking for is flip. And what's deeply ingrained in us is the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. It's deeply, deeply ingrained in us. And it will continue to be ingrained in us until the very end to some degree. Because when that's completely uprooted, then we'll find ourselves resting in ourself and not being pulled out, looking for ourself or completeness out there. And the flip-flop is a great opportunity for us to exclaim, realize, actually what I'm looking for is simply the end of suffering. Especially if it goes from flip to flop and then flip to flop in a relatively short gap. Because when the flips and the flops are long, unless we catch it just on the turn, then the contrasting effect sort of tends to be less obvious. When we see the contrast and feel the difference, and we realize my circumstance hasn't changed from yesterday to today, and yesterday I was feeling comfortable, life wasn't a problem, there was a spaciousness, there was an ease with my circumstance. People let me down, things cost more than I expected them to cost, people were nice to me, a mix of pleasure and pain, and there was a natural, effortless oneness, you could say, which is acceptance of what was going on without it feeling like it was an attack on who I am. And then the flop happens, circumstance pretty much the same. We don't find ourselves teleported onto a different planet where everything is different. Circumstance pretty much the same. And yet, the relationship to circumstance and the feeling about myself, in the flip, there was no sense of I'm not good enough or life is full of despair. That thinking just wasn't there. And then in the flop, what we find is there's this contraction and uncomfortableness, a story about ourselves that doesn't even seem like a story, it's a feeling. And that's the suffering that's present. And then the flip happens and it goes, and it's like, And it's effortless. And so that's the benefit of it, is some point for us to realize certain things about the difference between peace of mind versus suffering. And one of the biggest ones is, actually, I've seen it yet again. What I'm really looking for, in practical terms, is simply the end of this uncomfortableness with oneself.
So the flop kind of highlights when you're in that mode of constantly looking for pleasure, even if you don't necessarily know you are. Mm-hmm. The flop just brings you to a place where it's like, just let me breathe and be in peace. That's all. It brings you to that. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it can bring you to that realization. If it brings you to that realization, it's great. Is it not true that often in the flop, what comes over us is a spell that says, okay, to fix this feeling, I need to achieve this, this, and this.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that's the spell that comes over us, is the attachment to outcome. The belief that it's the uncomfortableness with oneself, because the attachment to outcome is a misunderstanding of who we are. It says what I am is something that needs things to look a certain way in order for me to be complete. So when the flop is there, automatically what we find is we go into achieving mode and controlling mode, thinking I need to sort this out. The other, well, it depends on what the nature of your flop is. Sometimes it's completely overwhelmed where you can't do anything. And so there's the opportunity, is to see, so this is another purpose of the flop, is to see what the nature of the suffering is. And if we catch ourselves seeking to fix a scenario, a circumstance in the flop, with a heavy investment in the outcome, and then we realize in the flip, I wasn't interested in doing that. I felt like, yeah, life will unfold as it's going to unfold, and I have no reason to mistrust life. I've always had a roof over my head, and even if I lose my job, something amazing comes and replaces it. That's the flip. In the flop, it's completely the opposite. So this is where we get to see, this is suffering, and what is it? What is the movement in that suffering? What is it? What's the story? But if we don't have the flip as a contrast, then we assume that, well, what are you talking about suffering? This is just life. This is how we live. This is it. That's why when a touching in to this other highway, this other gear, this other way of living, when that happens and we start tasting it, then the notion that the human being can live life in peace becomes much more than just wishful thinking. It becomes something we have some contact with. Just for the sake of the recording.
Not to belabor the flip-flop, but I was lucky in that on the way here, on the way to this retreat, I really got a very disturbing flop, which is interesting food for this situation we're in. Some people I had done some work for, actually I knew them, and they called, and they were just absolutely livid with me. They yelled at me about something, and it was hasn't happened in a very long time, and it was like actually two of them. They ganged up on me. It was a conference call, and it had a deep effect on me. My first reaction was, let's talk about it. The second reaction, as they kept going, was, okay, I'm going after you. And then I attacked them. It was very uncomfortable, very terrible. And then I let some time go by, and I thought, the only genuine thing that came out was I said, I don't know, I'm sorry about this. I never meant this to happen. I guess the point of the flop, it's in me now. And it doesn't feel, it can repeat itself as thoughts about, just thoughts, mental things. Mm-hmm. But this, it feels it's living in me. It's like living, it's all over me, kind of. Mm-hmm. Is this another aspect of the flopping?
Yeah, well, the suffering in an intense form isn't necessarily experienced as just commentary, as thought. In an intense form, it's a feeling that we could say is a feeling about who I am. Like if it's a feeling of being attacked, it's a feeling of being attacked at the level of myself. And so it's not necessarily recognized as a story because it feels much more tangible and real than just a story. At the base of these feelings if we really allow the feeling to be put into words, which we're often not intuitively inclined to do, because intuitively what we're often doing is trying to suppress the feeling so that it goes away, because it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. And so the biological aspect, or the well, I don't know if it's the biological or the psychological aspect of the human being, has decided that the best thing to do with this is to suppress it, to get it out of the space. And if there was no other way, then maybe that would be a good outcome, because it being in the space feels uncomfortable, and so the conclusion is, I've found the best solution to get rid of it. If it remains there, or it's intense enough, it will turn into an expression. Like we might find ourselves crying or shouting or hitting. And at the same time as that happening, if we put words onto it, we don't even need to put words in the expression if there are words. It's like, I hate you for what you did to me. We see that that feeling actually is, at its core, thought and story. So at the base of feeling, the feeling of suffering, there's always a story. It may not be recognized. Often there's an uncomfortableness. We feel a nebulous sort of uncomfortableness, and we don't know what it is particularly. So one of the useful movements that can happen after we hear about it, like after it becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, is the movement towards being with that feeling rather than distracting ourselves or, suppressing it through different modes. Simply because we understand or we hear that it's very important to see what the root of that feeling is. And the root of the feeling is always a story, which is thought. And to the extent that we can sit with a nebulous feeling of uncomfortableness and start to unpick it, or for it to start to flower, to blossom into a version that becomes more recognizable for what it is at its core. And one of the ways to do that is if there's the uncomfortableness and it doesn't have any definition to it at a particular point in time, is to start putting some words onto it. Words guided by the general framework that says that uncomfortableness or suffering is either guilt, blame, pride, worry, anxiety, expectation, or attachment to outcome. And so we might start off using those words. Say, okay, is this guilt or shame? Guilt and shame shame is a subcategory under the heading of guilt. And if it's blame and you put the word guilt onto it, the guilt sort of just falls flat. It's like, no, that's not it. If you put blame onto it, the word blame, and it is blame, what's likely to happen is there'll be a resonance. So, ooh, yeah, that's what it is, it's blame. And then under blame, you need to find then a subcategory that matches what it is. So this is a sort of process of a bit like having color swatches and putting the color swatches up to the wall to find what it is. So you're coaxing the feeling out with broad categories and narrowing it down as you go. So under blame, it could be, is it resentment? Is it hatred? Is it jealousy? Is it, just everyday ordinary blame for someone using up all the milk or whatever? And if we do that, the feeling can suddenly go from this uncomfortable feeling that can hang around for a long time, and we can start to feel it in more detail. And what we'll find is at the bottom of that feeling, essentially we find a story of guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. At the base of that, there is the belief in personal doership. where we see the other as a doer, and very importantly, this attachment to outcome, where we see that the attack or the pain that was delivered by, let's say in the case you mentioned, someone saying that you didn't do a good job. So that's pain in the moment. I'd prefer to hear that I did a wonderful job than to hear that I did a not so good job. So the pain is taken to be an attack on who I am. And so even if it's the pain of someone attacking us, not just telling us that we haven't done a good job, if someone is being aggressive towards us, that's pain. And if that pain is taken to be an attack on who I am at my core, then it turns into suffering. And so this is what we can start to see. Oh yes, at the base of this uncomfortable feeling, there is a particular story going on. And the story is always going to end up in doership and attachment to outcome. It has to have that somewhere at its base. And to the extent that we see it, we can be surprised at this being in the system, because sometimes it's very old stuff that wasn't processed at the time of the event. And the intensity of it, when it is coaxed out, when it's allowed to be there instead of us running away from it, the intensity of it can be amazing. And afterwards, I had no idea. I thought I'd resolved that issue. I thought I was fine with my mother or my father or my best friend or my sister or my ex-boyfriend or girlfriend. And I realized, wow, I wasn't, or I'm not, because this energy just came out. And we might find that we resolved part of it in a previous exploration of these energies in the system. And we thought it was all resolved, and now it's making its way up. And it can be making its way up, triggered by an event that mirrors it to some extent, a similar theme that happens in present day. So the feeling that arises triggered by something in present day is generally not all a result of this particular circumstance. It's that this particular circumstance is reminding us and uprooting, and stirring up a deeper sense of hatred or shame that's in our system that we hold towards the other or ourself from a long time ago. So it can be a great opportunity.
For me, I'll take it as I had no choice in my reaction there.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very painful in and of itself. There was a feeling of this is all automatic business going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's uncomfortable. It's not free, as you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really rang a bell, is the no choice in that matter,
Mm-hmm.
how I'm going to react.
Yeah.
And so that was very helpful regarding the choices. The more open, the more we sink in, there's more opportunity. And
Mm-hmm.
That's what I got out of that for now.
Yeah. Yeah.
With the gun, I like that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I use another example of that sometimes to demonstrate that particular scenario. Is if we have kids and we're having a tough time, one of the options is to adopt them out.
Why didn't we think of that?
Yeah. Now, that's not to say that that's what you're going to do, but at some point we are so constricted in our shoulds and shouldn'ts that we don't look at all of the options. And so it's about consciously looking at the options, and then we can consciously say, oh, I'm not going to adopt them out. That's no longer an option. We've taken it off the table. It's good to put the options on the table. You have an option to kill someone, so I'm not suggesting that you kill someone. But part of coming I repeat it, I'm not suggesting that anyone kills anyone. But part of the shift is to start seeing that in each situation there is a range of options. So one of the things you could do, also, it's only if you feel like it, is if we come to say money is part of pleasure and pain in life. So under the framework, it says that there is physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, and financial pleasure and pain. And our attachment to pleasure, which is often deeply ingrained in us, is what gets rid of some of our options. If something goes wrong and there's financial pain comes into the situation, we often feel attacked because financial pain is part of the situation, whereas actually we exist even in the face of that financial pain. It hasn't really attacked us on the level that we might feel it's attacked us on. And so one of the options is, I didn't intend for this to happen. It was an accident. And yet, one of the solutions might be to refund some of the money, for example. It might not at all be appropriate to do that. But sometimes we don't do that because of our attachment to certain things. Whereas if we do something like that and say, look, there's an option for you to have your money back if you like, and then the outcome we find is maybe not what we expect. They might say, oh no, we don't need that, we just would like you to do this. And you go, that's okay, we'll do that. They might, this is not some tricky strategy, right? They might say, thank you, we'll have our money back, and we'd like an extra 10%. But in doing it, in coming to that position, if that's appropriate, if it's what we feel like, we might go, wow, I didn't think that was an option that I was comfortable with. But if we see that it's financial pain is what this is, and it's not an attack on who I am, then that becomes an option that we can, including saying sorry, is an option. Sometimes people are just unreasonable, and it doesn't require us to buy into their unreasonableness.
In this case, I was doing it for free, so it even made it more confusing.
Yeah. Yeah.
A favor.
Yeah.
So this morning you talk about we actually spent a few minutes on meditation, and I can see that. I mean, meditation has benefits within your framework. I mean, I guess in the context of this morning, some benefits are that would be an opportunity to really explore the thinking mind, to see this deeply ingrained belief and how they play out. And also, again, the theme of this morning is the reinforcement. So there is the aspect of practice. I mean, knowing one thing intellectually, I mean, it doesn't change things instantaneously. So again, meditation is a practical things to do to appropriate that more. So I'm going to ask you a question about meditation, but I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to ask you first, because that would be stupid to ask you, oh, Roger, what techniques of meditation that you recommend? That would be totally betray my ignorance of your framework. But no, I understand your framework, so I would not ask you what techniques of meditation. But I do. I mean, whether sincerely or because of curiosity, ask you, would you have more to say on, instead of techniques of meditation, what types of meditation? Would that be a sort of, with, again, relative to your framework. I mean, not attacking other teachings, other schools of meditation, but when I say what types of meditation would be kind of a fit within the framework from the sort of more contemplation, reflective, to the sort of, a bit of concentrative effort to kind of a being mindfulness type of meditation. So anything more that you can say to the types of meditation? That was my question.
So
Can I
if you turn it off, it's good. Although hold on to it because you might need to say something more. No.
No, I just take it meditatively. No attachment. You may say nothing.
Okay, so without this being exclusively or absolute, because the opposite makes sense as well, some other opposites to what I'm saying is, one, I would meditate when you feel like meditating. That's very important from my point of view. Now, when I say it's very important, we can say, okay, that's it, I should only meditate when I feel like it. For some people, they're not ready to meditate when they feel like it. They might need to go to a meditation school that says this is what you can and can't do in this meditation, this is how you have to do it, and these are the rules. And so that could be valid for someone. That's not the sort of meditation that I found myself engaging in. So what I'm saying, I guess, is at a certain point, meditation is no longer a discipline. Meditation becomes a way of spending time that we enjoy and that's fruitful. It doesn't have to be enjoy, but that we see to be of value. And so therefore we do it not out of obligation, but out of an urge at a particular point in time during the day or during the week or during the month. And if it doesn't arise, if it doesn't happen for 3 weeks, then there's no sense that, oh, I should be meditating, or I didn't meditate for 3 weeks. You know, I didn't meditate for 3 weeks because I didn't feel like it. So we wait for that feeling to be there, and the feeling of doing what you feel like is there usually once meditation has proved itself to be something valuable to you. One of the most valuable things, it allows us to rest. So it's not about valuable because I'm going to get something very concrete out of it. It's just valuable because it's a resting. It's a way of exploring. Is another value of it, is we get to explore an inner world that we don't necessarily have contact with when we're talking to other people and functioning on a worldly basis. Our attention is outward, and so the inner world gets sort of left behind. So there's great value in meditating because it reveals an inner world. It's also a place to observe the movements of mind. And I found it's a great place to plan and solve problems. And I'll explain why meditation can be a great place to solve problems, because someone would say, that's strange, if you're trying to find solutions to your worldly problems, meditation doesn't seem like the place to do it. So that leads me on to the next point of what does meditation look like? In practical terms for Roger, and I mention it often when it comes to meditation, is allow everything to be as it is. Meditation is the witnessing of what is. It isn't about trying to change what is or create a certain state. That at some point we can hear life is meditation. You can live life, and life is meditation when we're living it a certain way. That means that we don't need life to be a particular way. It's about allowing life to be as it is. And when we find ourselves living life aware that even the arisings in the body are a happening. So emotion arises, and it's seen to be the arising of an emotion in a particular body-mind organism. Thinking is arising, and it's witnessed, it's recognized to be an automatic happening inside a body-mind organism based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if suffering is arising, the suffering is witnessed as a happening inside a body-mind organism. And so when speaking is happening, it's recognized as an automatic function coming out of a body-mind organism. Not my doing, but a happening. The question inspires the answer. If the question wasn't there, a different happening would be happening through this body-mind organism. If this body-mind organism's genes and up-to-date conditioning was different, then the question would be asked and the answer would be different. But it would all be it is all a happening. My hands are always moving, and I see them moving, and it's a happening, not my doing. A happening through a particular body-mind organism. And if we get to see the other as a body-mind organism functioning, then whatever the other asks is a happening through a particular body-mind organism. And so from that point of view, meditation to me is to just allow everything to be as it is. Allow the sounds to arise in the meditation space. Allow the sights and the noise, the smells, the sensations, all to be part of what is experienced. So there's no intention to achieve a particular outcome, especially no intention to achieve a quiet mind. If in our meditation practice a shift starts to be recognized, that we can be in meditation in one of 2 or 3 different forms, and we realize to some extent that we're not in control of which form of meditation is happening, or which movement in the meditation space is happening. Sometimes we might find ourselves with sort of swirls of light and color happening. And in my experience, this light and color is not exactly like a multicolored candy. The color isn't that vibrant. Often when I hear people say, you see all sorts of color, I'm wondering, are they seeing bright red and bright yellow and green? And maybe that's someone's experience of meditation. My experience when it comes to movement of light and color is I don't know, it's not as extreme as that, so I wouldn't like someone to think that that's what their meditation needs to look like. But there are times when there is this sort of movement inside the awareness of, let's say, light. At other times, there is a thinking that is part of the experience, and it becomes very obvious that there is attention solely on the thinking. And at other times, the thinking is happening, but I'm unaware of what is being thought about. It's as if there's someone in the distance talking, and it's very clear that talking is happening, but I have no idea what the thinking is about. There can be a shift that seems like we do it, where we might remember to bring attention to the back of the eyelids. And each time we bring attention to the back of the eyelids, or what we call the back of the eyelids, what in practice is actually becoming present with the vast open space, we might feel a shift, as though a bit like, the old signs at the airport that they've sort of got shutter type things, that we might be sitting in meditation thinking about something, and at a certain point there is a remembrance to bring attention to what we can call the back of the eyelids. And in that instance, it can feel like a shift out of thinking into more presence. So, on the one hand, it's allowing everything to be as it is. That would be what I would say the backdrop of meditation is, with no expectation of it being with or without thoughts, with or without color. It is simply awareness of the present moment. And I don't think you were here last night. You were, yeah. So we did a little exercise of becoming present with this experience. And we'll do another one over the weekend. And yet within what is happening, just like being present with this experience, there is certain speaking happening. Within the meditation, there can be certain shifts, like a shift out of thinking into something more present, that we don't control so much, but happen as our meditation practice develops. And so then we see our meditation practice changing, and yet it's not something that we have done as a discipline. It's more an evolution that happened within the context of just being interested and aware of what is. And it's important to have some framework of what we're aware of. So, for example, aware of the visual objects, which is, let's say if you do an open eye meditation, the visual objects make up a significant part of the experience. And so if we have no prompt to be aware of the visual aspect of the experience, we might think, well, what am I? I'm being present with what is. What is? You know, we might miss the fact that what is, in large part, is the visual experience. So once we get the prompt to just allow everything to be as it is, and part of what is the visual. So be aware of the visual, which means we might just find ourselves scanning slowly, or even staying still and allowing the whole thing to be there, or a bit of both, and realizing, yes, there is visual, and I'm interested in it. And I realize that it's there without me needing to think about it. I don't need to think that there's a door there for the door to be there. We can rely simply on the awareness of the visual of the door. Without needing it to be described as good or bad, nice or not nice, without the door needing to be quiet or open or closed. And sounds are a great part of the experience, because they tend to come and go more so than the visuals. And also a significant shift can be when we stop being aware, where we are convinced that the person or the body is what is aware. If we're convinced that we are seeing things because of the eyes, then in the meditation there is a residual self-image that exists and creates a separation in the meditation, just because of the assumption that I'm hearing things with my ears and seeing things with my eyes. It creates a sense of inside and outside. The sounds are outside of the body that is hearing them with its ears. Now, if we drop the idea that we are aware of the present moment from the body, this is not how we live our life. We don't live our life this way. This is for the purpose of the exercise. you might find that the body is not even that significant a part of the experience. That it might, unless you remember that you have a head and eyes, and insist that there are a head and eyes, you might find that being present with what is doesn't really inform you about a head and eyes. And yet what's undeniable is that there is awareness. And so from this point of view, the notion that the subject is the body has fallen away. And then any sounds that arise are no longer arising relative to the body. They're no longer outside of what I assume the subject to be. From the perspective of just knowing there is awareness of all of the experience, then the experience now fits inside awareness. Whatever is outside of awareness is not part of the experience. So anything that is in the experience has to be inside the field of awareness. And then the sense of who I am changes. We get another experiential feedback of who I am, different to what I know myself as when I'm living life generally in daily living, where the constant feedback is towards me as the body. So meditation can become an opportunity to know yourself as awareness that is not localized and exclusively of the body. And as that aspect develops itself, we might find ourselves functioning in life, moving through life, with this perspective being one of the perspectives from which we can live life, especially if we find ourselves sitting somewhere with not much to do, looking over a nice view. The need for the body to function, to be part of daily life in that moment is much less than if we were functioning in relation to others. And we might find ourselves dropping into this more open, spacious awareness of everything that is.
This keeps rising up in my mind, so I figured I might as well share it. Many decades ago, in college in the 60s, we were offered at RIT a course in Zazen because there was a Zen center there. And I picked up my first book from Alan Watts, was my introduction to this whole non-dual kind of thing. And there was one line in this book that's carried with me all these decades, and it was something to the effect of, in terms of meditation, you're talking about the head, the feeling of the head and the eyes and perception and vision and sound, where he said, if you concentrate and look back the other way from your eyes, look into the back of your head. In the sense of meditation, if you contemplate that, it's not even nothing. From your ear to ear back here, it's not even a void, it's just absolute nothing, no thing at all. Mm-hmm. Sometimes when you wake up in the middle of the night and you don't know what to do and you can't quite figure out a way to meditate, contemplate the back of your head. Mm-hmm. And see what happens, or not see what happens, because there's nothing to see. There's just that great void that the Tao talks about, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
I don't know, does it make any sense to anybody?
Sure, sure. It's nowadays the more common expression of that is through Douglas Harding's teaching of the headless way,
Oh,
which sounds like a derivation, like it could have derived from Zazen.
Douglas Harding?
Yeah, where it's called the headless way, where you actually function going through life with this meditative perspective, and at some point, because we're not continually reinforcing the idea of what is looking, we find that the residual self-image that makes us feel like I'm looking out of a head falls away, and then we realize we're just present, and the whole experience is arising where our head is meant to be. Like if we're present with this present moment and we wonder, where is my head? We realize the whole experience is where my head is meant to be. And at some point he has an exercise that does get you to look inward, point inward, and we realize that what am I looking at? It's like what is looking back at itself. And it can be a very powerful awakening technique or movement. So there's a lot out there that has merit. I don't focus very much on meditation, but I think meditation in a spontaneous, undisciplined in a way is what I found being useful. There were periods when I found I would want to sit in meditation much more than others. I don't think it was a significant part of my journey, except when I think about the fact that I'd walk around the park for 3 hours a day for 6 years, and that walk to me was all meditation. But it was meditation where I was looking at birds and seeing the particular differences of two types of bird, the dusky moorhen and the coot, that look quite similar until you really look at the difference. And so I would walk past a sign in the park that described the two, and then I'd say, oh yeah, they are two different birds. And so that movement was a movement of meditation, as far as I saw it, but it wasn't a disciplined meditation. So before people get too restless, and we're eating into our lunch time, mind the pun, maybe we'll call the morning session, call it to a close, and we can come back at sort of 20 to 3. Thank you.